Morning and welcome to this webinar this morning on R&D tax credits to give an update on the latest developments with HMRC. I'll just start off with formalities. This webinar has been recorded and we'll be sharing the recording with all attendees after we've finished. At the moment, all microphones and cameras are disabled, but the Q&A function at the bottom is working. So if you want to put any questions in, please use that. It's probably unlikely that we'll answer questions during this webinar, but we will follow up anything afterwards. For those that don't know me, I'm Matt Cook, partner here at Goodman Jones, part of the property and construction team. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Joe McGurk of Kene Partners. Joe is managing director at Kene Partners and an expert on everything R&D. We've worked with Kene Partners for a number of years now and helping a number of our clients. This is it's a short webinar. I'll try and keep it to 30 minutes long. We've broken it down into 3 sections. So the first section, we're going to have a quick chat about HMRC enquiries and sort of tapping into Joe's experiences on those. Second section, which is relevant to construction companies, is the recent Quinn London case, which some people may have seen in the news. So we'll just have a little chat about that. And then we'll finish off with thoughts on the future of R&D, what the latest things that are coming out of HMRC, including some stuff which is quite hot off the press. So Joe, let's start with HMRC inquiries. From my personal experience so far, there doesn't seem to be many of them. Many of clients have submitted their R&D claims. They've prepared them to the best of their ability. But I think there's a little bit of concern there. I mean, what if HMRC don't agree? So from what you've seen, what's your experience of inquiries? What's the chances of getting an inquiry?
I mean, it's an interesting one, Matt, because inquiries can be opened on the basis of randomized spot checks or targeted technical queries. Their figures are that between 2 and 5% of all claims are inquired into, but actually they're quite confidently stating that they've increased their inquiry rate by 100% this year. So we can imagine that to be between 5 and 10%. That's still actually quite a low number when you consider some 80,000 claims were submitted last year, which is a phenomenally large number. And following on from the Research Development Communication Forum yesterday, they believe that the same number, if not slightly more, will be submitted again this year. So the likelihood of getting an inquiry is in theory around 5 to 10%. This year, like yourselves, we've actually seen very few. Some people in the industry think it's a little bit of calm before the storm, and that something will be coming in conjunction with some of the changes that were outlined recently. But no, broadly, you have about a 10% chance of getting an inquiry. However, we're seeing very few at the moment themselves.
So not yet, but I mean, there have been stories about HMRC increasing their number of inspectors and everything. So I think the view is the number is going to increase.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, they very happily published figures last year, which reported 100 extra R&D staff. The truth of the matter is that they've actually lost a number of those to various other incentives and schemes being COVID related. So they actually, manpower wise, aren't much better off than they have been previously, but the numbers have been allocated. They are continuing to increase the numbers there. And yeah, with more inspectors, there'll be more inquiries for sure.
Interesting. And what would you say the main risk factors for an inquiry? What do HMRC look for raising an inquiry into a R&D claim?
I mean, there's a number of things they can look at. They can attack whether it's qualifying activities, qualifying expenditure. It can be understanding of the boundaries of R&D. But the most important thing is that if you have a robust methodology which supports the expenditure that you've identified in your claim and a clear, demonstrable understanding of the guidelines and legislation, then you're going to be in a good position to resist any HMRC inquiry. What they are really focusing on at the moment are erroneous claims, fraudulent claims, if you want to be a little bit fantastical with with the expression. But largely it's people who are claiming when they shouldn't be. And that's been an enormous issue for HMRC, coming off the back of an identified £311 million fraud last year. That's they're understandably cautious about issuing out credits without due diligence.
Good. And so I think it might be a good idea to say, from your experience, when you get an inquiry, what happens? Do you just get a letter, and just on R&D, or is it a like full scope inquiry and R&D just a bit of it, or?
No, so yeah, it's often starts very broad, but they normally have a direction, whether that's financial or technical. They know where they really want to inquire. They open up the scope of the initial inquiry is quite broad, so you'll get a letter outlining some of their concerns. It will often feel like they haven't read your claim, which is very frustrating. But the more you communicate with them, the more you start to understand actually where the concern is. And quite often it's to do with boundaries, technical understanding, very rarely to do with the size of the claim, whilst that might trigger an inquiry because it's in large number. Actually, if it qualifies, it qualifies. And they are very good in that respect. But first of all, you'll get a letter outlining their concerns. They might be financial, they might be technical, as I said. You would then respond with some evidence. HMRC would then respond to any additional or new evidence. From there, you would look to set up a teleconference, and they will typically use that as an opportunity to test the knowledge of the competent professionals and their understanding of of R&D. HMRC will then define any further queries, and you can either make an agreement or not. And then after that, of course, it can go to appeal, which we'll come on to later. But yeah, it's in theory quite a clean process. In practice, it's very drawn out. It can be quite invasive and incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and the thing is, we may be seeing more of them, so we'll see. And I think a question I do get asked quite a bit by clients is, when is a claim agreed by HMRC? Because what generally tends to happen is you submit everything. Well, sometimes the money comes through quite quickly. Sometimes it takes a bit longer. Can receiving the money from HMRC, or the credit, or the reduction in tax, can that be seen as the claim being agreed, or?
Yeah, this is another interesting one, Matt. I think people erroneously think that because they've received money, that HMRC effectively has approved their methodology of the work they're doing. And that's absolutely not the case. We have to remember these are self-assessment forms. So the majority of them will just be processed as would a normal tax return. It's only those 10% that go to inquiry that are really scrutinized, which is why people can be lulled into thinking, I'm doing a great job here. My R&D claim's amazing. I don't need to change anything. Actually, HMRC's requirements year on year increase. Therefore, the scrutiny you pay to your claim and the due diligence you pay to the figures therein should also increase.
Mm-hmm. And they have, how long do they have after? Is it how long do they HMRC have after submitting to raise the inquiry?
Well, in practice, it's a year. We've seen it stretch a little bit further than that, and HMRC typically hide behind the concept that they're protecting the exchequer and they can take as long as they want to. So we've actually had to resist inquiries that have been well outside of time. And they're quite robust with their insistence that they're still valid.
Okay, well, no scaremongering, but we haven't seen much, but we'll see. So I think that's it on inquiries. I think if we move on to our second part on this recent news on the Quinn London case, which is particularly important for construction clients. It's the first big one that's hit the news, really, where HMRC have picked up an inquiry and disagreed with a particular point, which is quite a strange one they picked up on. So effectively, it's if I understand it, trying to explain it, basically, it's where a subcontractor works for a main contractor, or has a contract for a main contractor, is getting paid for some work. That work includes some R&D. So the subcontractor's gone off and done the R&D and making the claim, but HMRC are sort of saying you're being paid by the main contractor to do that R&D. It's part of that contract. Subsidised is the word they use, isn't it? And
Yeah.
they've picked up on it on this case and said we disagree with it, but it's been thrown out, or
Well,
they've lost.
Yeah, they lost at first tier tribunal, and it is, you know, in some respects it's a landmark, but I'll come back to that. Broadly, you're right, Matt. Effectively, HMRC's stance was that if you're carrying out work that is contracted by a client, and that work requires R&D, and you're paid to do that work, then it is subsidised R&D. That's basically the long and the short of it. And that was thrown out because, in effect, that would mean that people who do work for clients can't claim R&D, which is a simplification of the summary, but really is the crux of it. The Quinn actually ended up being successful on the basis that HMRC focused on subsidised expenditure and had a really narrow and unfair interpretation of the legislation. It was because of this narrowness and because of the unfairness that it was thrown out. Having spoken with some of the HMRC inspectors yesterday, they actually feel like they missed an opportunity to claim on the to challenge on subcontractor basis, and they've made it very clear that their stance remains the same. Just because they've lost one doesn't mean they won't contend on exactly the same conditions in future, which is, you know, it's encouraging in some ways because they are being consistent. It's actually concerning because I think some of us were hoping this would offer some level of precedent. They've been very clear. The Quinn ruling offers no precedent. So we won't be able to bring it up in future inquiries, Matt, which is frustrating. But it does give us sort of an angle of attack, and it shows that actually the law is pretty much on our side. Yeah.
So is there a big risk then for subcontractors making claims being paid for main contractors? What?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think HMRC's stance and what actually goes through are two different things. I mean, they've been successfully challenged, so we can all feel confident that if we were to challenge and conditions are right, then there's no reason they can't claim. HMRC are obviously narrowing the scope of R&D, and it's a contentious issue, and we disagree with HMRC's stance on subcontracted R&D and subsidy. There's a 65% cap already. They've already restricted what you can claim. The suggestion that no one is allowed to claim valid R&D because of the terms of a contract is fairly unlikely that will hold much water if it's challenged time and time again.
So what is there any advice to subcontractors? Is there anything they can do currently to protect their position?
Yeah, I mean, I think the company can really protect itself by preparing to dispel the evidential burden with documentation and evidence, and show the role between the sort of client and organization for whom the work was delivered and the party giving the instruction, or with the autonomy for resolving the uncertainties. It's really important that contracts are clear about what is included. You can actually go as far as to say this will not include any subsidized costs for R&D. You could be really, really explicit in your contract, and that would really help. But in lieu of that, the best thing you can do is evidence that you are the experts carrying out R&D independently of the company that's contracted you to do it without their direction. And that's often the case. However, in the construction sector, quite often, many of those conversations will happen on the phone. Decisions are made on the hop. It's about getting into the habit of documenting the work you're doing, because it will protect you down the line.
Yeah, so it's almost like separating your R&D, isn't it, from the contract you're doing, a separate department, and just documenting it all, I guess.
And I think, Matt, I mean, we'll come on to it later, but the future of R&D and record keeping well, the focus on record keeping has become more and more important. People are going to have to be able to keep records and evidence the work that they're doing. And it might go as far as needing to make applications for R&D within the year that the R&D is carried out.
Well, we'll come on to that because yeah. So I think is that everything on the Quinn London case? Do you think there's nothing else to mention?
I mean, I think one thing to mention is HMRC absolutely will not be challenging this decision.
Okay.
So they have accepted it. They don't agree with it. And actually, it was very, very interesting to hear them talk about the case, because it was through gritted teeth. They really feel like they missed an opportunity to inquire into another aspect, but they were out of time. And going forward, they'll continue to open inquiries, and actually they'll also challenge subcontractor status as well as subsidy at the same time. So it was a reluctant loss for them.
Yeah, things move so fast, isn't it? I mean, we were only talking the other day, and we were expecting HMRC to appeal, but now you're saying they're accepting it and moving on.
It's interesting. There's another subsidy-based case, Haddy, which was years and years ago, and HMRC won that, and they shouted that from the rooftops. It still gets brought up now. Interestingly, it seems like they're going to be brushing Quinn under the carpet and not talking about it. It makes sense because it doesn't really work in their favor.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there'll be another one soon. So if we move on to final part, the future of R&D. So I think it's good news. I think first of all, what was announced in the recent budget on R&D? Do you just want to explain through that?
Yeah, so there was some good news and some bad news. The good news is that they've broadened the scope a little bit. So they're going to allow costs for cloud hosting, computing, and data, which they've resisted for years and years, but are completely valid areas of expenditure from an R&D perspective. So that comes as really, really good news. Some slightly worse news in that they're thinking of, well, they are intending to remove the ability to claim for subcontracted R&D that's carried out outside of the UK. They broadened on that. They broadened on that a little bit yesterday. That will be extended to EPWs. They haven't confirmed whether or not it will affect companies with branches in other countries, but I think we can safely assume that if they're not subject to PAYE in the UK, they won't qualify. Beyond that, there's a lot of focus on automation and fraud reduction, and a move towards digital submissions. And it's all part of this refining of the process, but also addressing some serious fraud that's been undertaken in the industry.
Yeah, oh, good. So I mean, I've always thought that HMRC have for R&D, they get allocated a pot of money, which is they've allocated that will be claimed by companies doing R&D. Is it right to assume that pot is still there, or is it increased or same amount?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's their view?
Incrementally, the pot is increasing year on year. It's by 2027, 28. That the intention is that it will amount to 2.4% of GDP, which is an astronomical amount of money. Some £8 billion was claimed last year, for instance, Matt. That number goes up year on year. HMRC are willing and they want to be able to invest that money. They want to award it to clients, to businesses in the UK, but they do have to address the leakage that's been caused by erroneous claims, a misunderstanding of the schemes, some real abuse by both advisors and taxpayers, and it's good that they are taking this seriously now. It's great for us. It's great for our clients, right, Matt? We want them to be making valid claims. We want them to know that they're not going to have a knock on the door or a brown envelope from HMRC. But it means in the short term there will be some real administrative burden for us. And look, frankly, the average claim size in the UK for SMEs is above £50,000. I think we can all swallow a little bit of admin for £50,000 if necessary.
Yeah, no, I think the good news is the government clearly want UK companies to innovate, and they're willing to have this pot of money to distribute to those companies that want to innovate and claim properly. So the good news is R&D is around. It's going to be around for a long time, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, here and abroad, it's the inquiry process can be daunting, as is any direct dealing with HMRC. But frankly, it's enormously generous incentive that we need to protect, and they need to protect, so it can actually be spent as it's intended to be going forward, and the scheme can remain in place.
No, good. Something flashed up just last week. There's a document released by HMRC, so it's all very hot off the press. What was that about? Oh, and I've got a slide which I'll share in a moment. But just want to explain what it was that HMRC have released and what they're doing.
So HMRC effectively released. They kind of fatted out some of the budget, but also they provided a bit more detail about the scheme as it is, and the intentions for it going forward. What I think the main, there are some automation points. So going forward, returns and claims will have to be submitted via the online portal as you would normally submit a tax return. Historically, it's been possible to email them through to an inbox. This encourages, or at least enables, a little bit of that kind of misbehavior from certain agents, whereby they might white label their reports. HMRC don't know who they're coming from. It also takes away that usual due diligence that's undertaken when a tax return is submitted. Above that, there's also a suggestion that we will be required to make an application or give notice of intention to submit an R&D claim within a financial year. This is great news for some reasons. It will mean that people have to think about their R&D as they're doing it. It will probably mean record keeping has to be better. The downside is, if you're not currently claiming R&D and you were to discover through a conversation with Matt that you carried out some qualifying activity a couple of years ago and it's within time for an amendment, that amendment is no longer valid. The R&D claim won't be able to be made retrospectively because you would have had to have notified HMRC within the year. So that's actually a potentially very, very restrictive change that could come into action.
Yeah, I think this. I'll share my. I'll just share my screen. So I put together a little, just a quick slide here of five interesting points, which I think one of them you were just covering off there. These are 5 points. These are proposals at the moment, aren't they? They're not in force, but they're just right. Proposals that HMRC have put into a document that will come into effect next year, or was it the year after?
Yeah, 2023.
2023. So these are five points. I mean, the first one, claims must be made digitally. I think you sort of touched on that, but I don't think that'll be a problem. I mean, everything we submit is all electronic, and that shouldn't be any issue whatsoever. More detail required. Can I read that as being you have to submit the R&D report? Because I have heard of cases where you just put the number in the tax computation and don't submit any report with it, and it still goes through okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. HMRC don't actually require you. There's nothing legislation that says you need to submit a report, which is strange. So they're effectively confirming what we all knew, which is you should be submitting a report to justify your R&D.
So this means you have to submit a report, basically.
That's right. Yeah,
yep.
Absolutely.
Endorsed by a senior officer. I mean, that's an interesting one, because I would have thought all tax returns are signed off by a senior officer. Is Does a
Yeah,
does the
this
senior
is specifically the R&D claim, and Matt, this is the interesting thing about digital submissions, isn't it? Because you can just put a name in a box and there's no signature required. And I think the suggestion is that senior officers should always be aware of making these kinds of claims, and that they will be responsible for signing them off. The thinking there is that it's more due diligence. People will think twice about making claims, the content of them, reviewing, all stuff we should be doing anyway.
Yeah. And this is the one you were just talking about, which I can't quite get my head around, is need to inform HMRC in advance. So you were just saying there, in the year, you have to inform you have to inform HMRC in the year you're carrying out the R&D. So say your year end is 31st December 2021. Are they proposing to make an R&D claim in that year? You have to tell them before 31st December 2021. Yeah,
absolutely. And their argument for that is, sorry, I'm getting pinged with lots of messages. Apologies for that. Their argument for that is that if you're carrying out R&D and you're a competent professional and the work that you're doing is not readily deducible, then you should know. You should know when you're doing it. It should erase the need for retrospective claims. And if you don't, effectively the system, they won't give us any detail on yet because they haven't figured it out. But what they're proposing is you would apply through a portal with HMRC. You would get a code which would be attached to your R&D claim when it goes in. And you could say, we made intention to submit an R&D claim back in December 21. Here's the R&D.
Interesting. Yeah, that's quite a big change. And no going back to the year before that, and there could be some misclaims as well. So you've got to be quite on it.
People really need to be on it, because we know that there are lots of clients who aren't claiming. There are lots of companies that should be claiming that aren't. This could really give them. We've basically got an 18-month window in order to get those claims submitted. Otherwise, they could miss out in time.
Yeah. And the final one they're proposing, which I think is one you're quite excited about, is you've got to actually put details of your R&D agent, I guess, or name who it is. So I don't know what you're thinking behind that is, but all I can deduce from that is that there may be some agents they don't like as much. I don't know. I can't.
It gives them the opportunity to target agents they know who are submitting erroneous claims or don't have a good understanding of the scheme. It's great news. It's great news. It means that you really have to put your name to the claims you're submitting. And of course, and I know that in the past you have as well, put your name on everything that goes to HMRC. They know exactly who it's coming from. This coupled with the digital submission will really address some of those sort of those spurious advisors, as is the popular term.
Yeah. Okay. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. Just a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else coming out of the proposals you wanted to mention at all? From your discussions yesterday.
Yeah,
very hot off the press.
Yeah, I think processing times. So HMRC have acknowledged that they've been very slow. They leaned on the fact that COVID's affected everyone. They're no exception to that rule. But they produced figures that suggest they've processed 98% of their claims this year within time. Matt, I think you and I have both felt the sharp end of HMRC's processing times recently, and I find it difficult to believe, and I don't really understand where those figures are coming from. But in effect, they acknowledge that there's a manpower issue. They acknowledge that they haven't processed claims as quickly as they could have, and they are addressing it. And it's something they are really prioritising.
Yeah, no, I've seen an improvement just recently. Actually, we've had some big ones come through, but no, that's all good. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Joe. I think we're at 11 o'clock, so I'll just leave up on the slide. There's myself and Joe's contact details. So if anyone has any further queries, wants to discuss anything, just drop us a line. and we'll be happy to help. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Joe. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.